Apologies for that. Now, a 12-story Gaza tower block housing the offices of the US-based Associated Press and Qatar-based broadcaster Al Jazeera, the Associated Press and AFP, also known as Agence France Presse, collapsed on Saturday after being struck by Israeli missiles. The owner of the building had been warned in advance of an impending Israeli missile strike, and the building had been evacuated. The Israeli military did not immediately provide comment on the incident. The building also contained a number of apartments and other offices. Meanwhile, several people have been arrested in Israeli Arab towns and mixed communities amid Israel and Hamas's most intense hostilities in years. According to Israeli police, 15 protesters were arrested in the central city of Lot. Now, the city has seen nightly disturbances since the fighting between Israel and Hamas started on Monday. Synagogues have been attacked and street fights have broken out, prompting Israel's president to warn of civil war. Authorities say at least 132 people have been killed in Gaza since Monday. More than 900 others are wounded. For more now, as promised, on what's happening in the Middle East, we are joined on the line by our foreign editor, Sophie Mokoena. Firstly, Sophie Mokoena, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Choose the pictures that we saw from the reporter out in the Middle East. In fact, she was at that building, reporter of Al Jazeera, seeing those buildings being shot down of media houses. It has escalated quickly. It is not a good sight what's happening out in the Gaza Strip.
Shocking indeed, Thabiso. You know, an hour ago I received a message from Thembisa Fakude, the former bureau chief of Al Jazeera in the Southern Africa, but he is now based in Doha, doing other tasks at the network at the headquarters. And, while I was still thinking and trying to get contact and perhaps to speak to the executive producer, your executive producer, Melissa, to see what we can do, and also giving information to other producers to monitor Reuters feed, then the visuals were already there. So clearly the Israeli military did call those who are affected to warn them, and that is why the personnel was able to be evacuated and the building was empty. And therefore, within a very short space of time, the Israeli military did bomb that building, and you can see, I can't believe the destruction. This is a building that is housing media houses, a clear and a direct attack on media freedom. This reminds me of Adolf Hitler. When you read and you understand what he was doing and who he was targeting, you ask yourself that what is happening in the 20th century? Yeah. It was only a few days ago, I was speaking to the ambassador of Russia at the function where they were commemorating the Victory Day. Him warning the world that the issues of conflict and provocation are very dangerous because they can easily lead us to a very disastrous moment. And we don't want another Third World War, because in terms of how countries have amassed and accumulated sophisticated military artillery, anything can happen. When I saw that, when you see it, fortunately, Al Jazeera was quick to capture that story. And remember, during the week, there were other buildings that were attacked. And I am asking myself, where is the international community?
Sophie, let's come in right there. I mean, Al Jazeera, that building, we hear on the sidelines people saying, or reports coming from the Israeli Defense Force saying, Hamas uses those buildings to hide, to plan attacks across the border across to them in Israel, and that's why that building, one of the reasons why it was targeted. Now, the question I would then ask, Al Jazeera, since its establishment in 1996, and I said this in the last hour, it has changed the status quo of how Arab media are viewed across the world. They've challenged narratives have Al Jazeera. They've got 70 bureaus around the world. They have about 5,000 staff, and they are on the ground, in particular in Arab countries and in Western countries. And the narrative is almost a slap in the face for countries like Israel, who are accused of, well, crimes such as what we're seeing right now. I do not want to say war crimes because, yes, those are being investigated, but it's a slap in the face when you have an Arab media house saying you're a war criminal. Would that be a reason why they were targeted, Sophie?
Clearly, Al Jazeera has taken a decision to go where many of us are not able to go. And of course, they will make enemies. You know, the problem with politics and governments and dictators around the world, when you challenge them, you must be ready for an attack. Verbal, cyber, physical, and this is what's happening to Al Jazeera. Because when you check their coverage, they are covering the story from both sides. They are in Israel, they are in Palestine. And therefore, they are trying to reflect a very balanced view. When many Western media have decided to camp in Israel, you know, or at the border, they don't get first-hand information sometimes from the Palestinians themselves. And this story of Middle East, when it's reported, sometimes it gets extorted, because sometimes we cover just Palestinians, sometimes we just cover just Israeli or the Israel side, and therefore it is what Al Jazeera has identified as a weakness, and they have decided to try and give a balanced view. And therefore, for Israel, it doesn't sit well with them. I mean, when you look at that destruction, first-hand information and visuals, the children who are dying, those visuals don't paint a good picture. And I think any dictator will do just that. And we know the hostility. We know the hostility. These two countries or these two nations have been fighting and fighting. The world has failed to bring peace between the two groups. And therefore, it is getting out of hand. I mean, and fortunately, with social media, you can't hide anything now. You don't need big cameras and satellites. You can do it with digital platforms.
And we saw the pictures. 132 people have been killed in Gaza since Monday, more than 900 wounded. Also deaths on the Israeli side. Here's a question, Sophie. Let's bring it back home now to the continent, in Africa in particular. What has Africa said? Have we heard anything from the leaders of the continent? Because, for example, South Africa has a pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, working together side by side, living together side by side approach to this. And we know over the years, even Utatu Mandela himself tried to broker a peace. If I can put it that way, for lack of a better term, where are we on the continent? What are our leaders saying?
The African Union did issue a statement condemning what's happening and the attack directed at Palestine. And also, you know that Palestine Authority has got observer status at the African Union. So Africa is indeed friends of Palestinians. But you know that sometimes the independence and the autonomy of countries also take shape. I am very disappointed with Kenya. Kenya is currently in the Security Council. You know, we were in the Security Council on rotational basis, and we were replaced by Kenya on rotational basis. Nothing, no statement from Kenya as a member country of the Security Council. But South Africa, by now, would have issued a very hard-hitting statement in terms of what's happening in the Middle East. South Africa is not going to change its policy position in the Middle East as long as you have the African National Congress. The African National Congress is clear in terms of a push for Palestine self-determination, because all people are entitled to self-determination, and that's the starting point. However, they are also calling for two-state solution, so that you also take into consideration the plight of the Israelis. Therefore, South Africa's approach is clear, pro-Palestine stand, but also saying, as that is happening, you must also ensure that you protect and defend the rights of Israelis. And therefore, you must have a two-state solution.
Yeah. Let's bring it back, maybe even closer to home here in South Africa. 10 Downing Street a couple of weeks ago announced that South Africa had been invited to the G7 UK summit. South Africa will join the likes of Australia, India, South Korea. We know that India, in fact, has pulled out President Modi because of the current pandemic of COVID back home. President Cyril Ramaphosa has got a chance to reach out to the G7 and hopefully bite an ear of Joe Biden and the French President Macron on what is going on. Would he have an impact, if any?
I'm sure South Africa is currently disappointed. You know, a few days ago, the Biden administration released the speaking notes or the telephone notes between President Biden and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. America has taken a pro-Israel stance and position, which is not new, even though the text is more diplomatic. And when President Biden was elected, we knew that not much is going to change in terms of America's position. Perhaps with the Democrats and Joe Biden, it will be more diplomatic. And therefore, I think this is an opportunity for President Ramaphosa, if that meeting will indeed go ahead in June, early June of the G7 countries. South Africa has been invited, and therefore, on the margins of the G7, South Africa can speak to these leaders individually. And this is something that should be high on the agenda of those bilateral talks, to say, let's find peace in the Middle East. And then two, of course, let's talk about the other problem, another war we are fighting, that is COVID-19. But also next week during the Africa France summit, I expect President Ramaphosa, when he interacts with the president of France, Macron, to also touch on what's happening in the Middle East. And I saw earlier on the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium did call the European Union Commissioner on Foreign, Peace and Security Affairs to say they have to take a position and something must be done to stop what's happening in the Middle East. And therefore, I think it doesn't only have to be when they meet, when President Ramaphosa is meeting the G7 leaders, but even on the sideline of the France-Africa summit, even also speaking to the African continent leaders to say, let's put pressure on the two sides to find a solution.
Sophie, I think you'll correct me if I'm wrong. I think over the years, in fact, in particular, with the incidents right now happening in the Middle East between in the Gaza Strip there with Israel as well as Hamas, we've seen more people come out in the streets and make, I'll say, more noise of it. We've seen it, whether it's in the UK, we've seen it in the US. I know some parts of the US have come out in support of Palestine, saying, yes, maybe your reproach is a bit heavy-handed. It is Israel. You cannot be, bringing bazookas to a knife fight, so to speak, if I can use that term. Will this ever change? What will need to happen, Sophie? Because we've seen this year in and year out. In 2014, it escalated to this point. What will change? What will bring peace in the Middle East? If I can put it to you as our foreign editor, what will need happen?
Two-state solution is the only way. Secondly, the international community must stand firm in ensuring that the two groups do take negotiations and peace talks seriously. Cessation of hostility. Stop the conflict now. and therefore put pressure on the two groups to find one another.
Sophie Mokoena, SABC News foreign editor, thank you indeed for joining us. Thank you for your insights. Let's take the story forward. Thembisa Fakude, as I promised, former bureau chief at Al Jazeera Media Network, Southern Africa, joins us now. Themba, welcome to SABC News channel. I don't know whether to say condolences. We don't know what happened to some of your colleagues who worked in that building, as we saw in those pictures. The conversation we're currently having with Sophie Mokoena now. Can you give us the latest on what happened earlier today? Thembisa Fakude, can you hear me? Thembisa Fakude, I'm not quite sure whether you heard me.
I can hear, but very slant, but I can hear you.
Okay, I'll try and get our technicians to boost my audio. What I was saying, Thembisa, could you just give us a rundown of what happened earlier this afternoon? We saw a building housing your colleagues and other media houses being demolished by the Israeli Defense Force.
Hello?
Yes, Thembisa. Please go ahead.
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, please go ahead. Tell us the latest, please.
Well, the situation, I hope I caught your question correct. But anyway, I'll just say, first of all, that this is a very sad day for journalists and journalism and the freedom of expression. But importantly for our colleagues in Gaza who had only received a notice from one of the neighbors in the building where Al Jazeera offices are situated that the Israeli Defense Force intended to bomb the building. So if it was not because of that notice, which was, by the way, from a neighbor, one of the residents in that building, the Israeli Defense Force would have bombed the building and killed all the journalists that were currently at the office. So it is quite a sad day at the moment. We're still counting the costs of the damage. No one knows precisely how much is the damage and how many people have died, if at all members of Al Jazeera were killed.
I was scared, I was afraid to say condolences because, yes, we do not know if any of your colleagues lost their lives in that Israeli airstrike. Why, I want to put it as bluntly as possible, Thembisa, why do you think the Israelis bombed that building? Reports say there's thoughts that Hamas use it to stage attacks across the border, but one would say no, Al Jazeera has changed the narrative of an Arab broadcaster, and maybe that is why you were targeted.
Well, nobody knows. I mean, it's not the first time, by the way, that Israeli has done this to one of our properties. Nor have they threatened to bomb Al Jazeera. You know that when the Arab Spring started also in Egypt in 2011, the Egyptians did the same. We know that the Americans were intending to do the same in our offices in Afghanistan. They did the same in Iraq. But this time around, there is absolutely no excuse because Al Jazeera is quite a known figure or an organization in part of the world. But we also share the offices with the Associated Press. But forget about that. There are thousands of people living in that building, women and children. And for a government that claims to be the only democratic government in the Middle East to commit such crimes, it shows the level of impunity that this right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu is willing to go. And we just have to wait and see what will be the reaction and what the countries around the world and the people of the world will do about this. But this kind of impunity, yesterday it might be Al Jazeera and other media networks in that building, but it actually threatens freedoms of expression and journalism throughout the world, and it has to be nipped off the butt. And if it's not done today, I'm afraid this could become the new normal when it comes to regimes and institutions or governments that disagrees with the narrative that journalism sometimes assumes.
And Thembisa, you are head of English unit at Al Jazeera Center for Studies. These are just some of the things that I'm sure you go through when continuing your education of up-and-coming journals, is that it's not all gloomy, it's not all rosy being a journalist. There are days where you are at the end of a text such as these.
Yes, I mean, things are getting much more difficult. I mean, if you're going to have countries like the United States refusing to condemn such actions, really things are getting much more difficult for journalists around the world. And if you're going to have countries like the Western countries also keeping quiet while journalists are persecuted not only in the Middle East and in Gaza and places like Russia, China, Hong Kong recently, the situation for journalists is quite dire, and it requires an immediate intervention and condemnation from the highest sport which decides on international matters and relations, which is the United Nations.
I was asking my colleague Sophie Mokoena a short while ago, how does one stop this war happening in the Middle East? Maybe that is too open-ended, that question, because I don't think anyone can find an answer now. Here then comes the question with Al Jazeera. In as far as objectivity is concerned, Al Jazeera is covering both ends, in Israel as well as in Palestine. Surely, getting the right narrative, getting the correct news coming out of Palestine as well as from the Gaza Strip as well as from Israel, objectively, this is an attack on the news of what is happening in the Middle East, because shutting you down, that means we'll only get one-sided information, and that'll be from Israel.
Certainly. I mean, you've seen during this recent onslaught on people of Gaza, very few international organizations were actually present with their camera people, etc., to cover the actual events in Gaza. Only Al Jazeera, because we have a permanent office there, was able to cover the story as it was unfolding. And I think that's what the Israelis are trying to do. They actually realize that our work in the Gaza Strip has continued to keep the world viewership alive to the realities that are currently going on in that part of the world. And the attempt, of course, is not only to intimidate, but to shut down the only media institution that is currently really broadcasting relevant pictures and telling the story of the atrocities that are continually perpetrated by the right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu.
Your journalists have certainly come out with compelling videos, compelling stories of children, babies found underneath rubble, killed by those Israeli strikes. When will you get an update from your colleagues, Thembisa? And I'm sure as a tough and seasoned journalist and news organization, the job will continue. You'll strive to continue broadcasting and telling the story from location.
Thank you.
Thank you very much there, Thembisa Fakude, speaking to us via the line. Al Jazeera Center for Studies, Head of English Unit for Al Jazeera, just giving us an update on that building. As you saw there, those pictures, they're building in the Middle East. It was shut down by Israeli Defense Force. We saw the first pictures, we got the heads up rather from a media, a colleague of Thembisa. Her name is Lina Al-Safin, who said they'd been given a warning to evacuate that building, the Jilal building in the Gaza Strip. It housed 3 media networks. That's Al Jazeera, the Associated Press of America, as well as the AFP, which is a French press. That building was targeted by Israeli missiles, and as Fakude said, Bob Fakude, hopefully his colleagues were out in time, and so far he says he has not received any fatalities or reports of fatalities from his colleagues, and we hope they're all safe with regards to having gotten out. And hopefully they continue their coverage and telling the story of the people from the Gaza. Now, just on